So welcome, Laniel. The floor is yours for 20 minutes.
That was officially the best bio opening I've ever had. That was fantastic. Thank you. So Laniel Bateman, Director of Climate Change Adaptation Policy at Environment and Climate Change Canada, which means that I'm responsible for national policy on adaptation, and I'm really pleased to be here. So bonjour à tous et à toutes. I wanted to start just by thanking Grandma Shingoose for your opening this event up in a good way. And to acknowledge the Indigenous lands and territories that we're on gathered here today, First Nations and Métis. And I'm wearing a Métis pin that was gifted to me by the Métis National Council, and again, in recognition of this land and its importance for the Métis peoples. So I'll be presenting on the National Adaptation Strategy, and I think I've heard lots of references to it throughout the event over the last 2 days. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about the progress in implementing the strategy and kind of where we're at in the cycle. And we're actually at an important juncture in the cycle, so it's really good timing to have this presentation. So thanks, Liz, for the opportunity to present today. So turning to my, I need the clicker. I'm used to somebody else clicking for me. So I'll do a little bit of a background on the National Adaptation Strategy just for folks who might not be aware of it. So it's a national strategy, so whole of society, that's really important. It's not a federal strategy, not a provincial strategy, but meant to really encompass the action that's taking place all across the country, from local level to national level. And understanding what's taking place and what's guiding our actions and establishing some priorities in that regard. It sets national goals, objectives, and targets to move climate readiness forward. And we've identified a monitoring and evaluation framework that's designed to improve and adjust and track our progress over time. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the implementation mechanisms as well. So just a little bit on the structure. So I mentioned it sets out an overarching vision, has the goals, objectives, targets, and then action plans, different ways that the strategy is being implemented. And it has 5 interconnected systems. The systems approach is a meaningful categorization to reflect the interconnectedness of all the work that we're trying to do on adaptation collectively across Canada. And you'll see on the left a reference to guiding principles, and that's really important as well, especially in a country like Canada, where the guiding principles that include things like respect for jurisdiction are upholding Indigenous rights. You can imagine those are really meaningful and important when we talk about how we take action, given the shared responsibility for adaptation or the importance of Indigenous rights in the way that we proceed with our work. So today I'm here to talk about progress and implementation, and there was some stock take of progress, as already been mentioned, very, very early on in the process, but now we're about 3 years into implementation. And so we're at the state of where we wanted to take stock of progress because we'll be renewing the policy cycle. And so a progress report is being prepared. Many of you are involved in the elaboration of the National Adaptation Strategy. Those of you in the room, I'm still saying thank you. And then we're also now reporting progress, and I think many people were contributing to that as well. So my thanks continue for those providing input. In terms of the progress, we want the progress report to be a realistic stock take, so you won't be surprised if you see it's not going to sugarcoat things. It's going to be an honest reflection of how adaptation is taking place across Canada. So we hope it celebrates some of the opportunities and successes, but it won't shy away from reflecting some of the areas where we have more work to do collectively to advance adaptation action. I'll start just by talking a little bit about the Government of Canada Adaptation Action Plan. So as I mentioned, it's a whole of society strategy meant to be what's happening at the national level. At the federal level, just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the programs and measures that are being implemented. So when we did it's the first National Adaptation Strategy, and it's the first federal plan as well. And so we rolled up what all the measures were taking place across the federal government. And importantly, I think one of the things that we reflect on is Canada didn't have a strategy before, and we do now. And so maybe you might say to yourself, well, Laniel, I don't know if I sleep better at night. Thanks, we have a strategy. I'm not sure if I feel reassured. But I think the important component is about how it sets priorities and is driving investments and adaptation. So that's really what I want to mention is about some of the programs and investments. And so some of the colleagues, fellow panelists who will be speaking, will be talking about some of those important federal investments and programs that are driving action. So the strategy is one thing, but the programs and the investments that fall under it are really important. So whether that's First Nations Adapt that was helping fund some of the projects, or the Green Municipal Fund, which I'm particularly proud of because it was one of the biggest investments that the federal government has made in adaptation, at $530 million in driving action at the local level, and really designed well, I think, by colleagues at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities in a partnership with us to really be filling a space where the programs and measures were not just going to the large municipalities and the big cities, but really trying to get at the local action and capacity and support as well as projects. So just really wanted to mention that, and colleagues who were presenting talked about standards, so thanks for that shout out as well, where the National Adaptation Strategy is funding some of those things. The other one that I would mention on this slide is the bilateral cooperation mechanisms, and this has been really important as well. In Canada, we've had multilateral mechanisms for cooperation, so the big one is the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, where we cooperate together on adaptation projects. But importantly, as we were doing our work on the National Adaptation Strategy, we really found that the context and the needs by each jurisdiction, each province, each territory was really unique. Different provinces and territories were at different places in their steps on adaptation, different priorities, different risks. And so we took this bilateral approach, and where we've been establishing formal tables for dialogue so that we can talk about each other's priorities and help wayfind into the federal system to find projects, and whether that's funding, whether that's capacity and support, to help advance regional priorities, because we felt that that was really important. And so this is new, it's a new approach that we've taken, but I'm happy to say it seems to be working so far. So we have 6 bilateral cooperation arrangements in place, and you may see 5 on the slide. So hot off the press, I have news to release that as of last week, we have one with Ontario. So new news. So we have one with Manitoba, Northwest Territories, Yukon, Prince Edward Island, and Quebec, and as I mentioned, now with Ontario. And I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but we've been having good conversations with the Atlantic jurisdictions as well. And week after next, we're going to be there for the ClimateAtlantic event. So we hope that we'll have more of these in place. And so again, just that cooperation and coordination between governments, which doesn't sound like a lot, but for many of you know that coordination and cooperation can actually be a really meaningful component of our work. I'll talk a little bit about the progress that's being made for some of you who might be interested in the data that will be released. We set 25 targets under the National Adaptation Strategy. About 9 of them are near-term targets, and happy to say that 8 of them were either on track to meet or surpass. I think when we set the targets, the near-term ones were a little easier to meet. The further out you go, the more aspirational and harder that they get to meet. And so you'll see some of these on the slide here. One important one is about federal infrastructure funding, including climate resilience. That says infrastructure funding, not housing funding. So I think it's been discussed, still some work to do in the housing space, but for infrastructure, a commitment to reflect resilience considerations. Disaster financial assistance arrangements. And this one is really important because it's funding that can happen after disasters, and really improving the linkages between our preparedness and prevention, what they call mitigation in the emergency management space, with our work on adaptation, and bringing those more closely together so that there's funding where we can build back better and reflect climate considerations. So that's been a really important one. I'll mention another one on Surpassed. My colleagues from the Canadian Centre for Climate Services are here in the room, Heather and Casey, and they set a target for users accessing climate services, and we had nearly 300,000 users accessing climate services. So we see that the needs and the thirst for information is growing. Mentioned earlier a little bit, and that came up in another panel about awareness. And so you'll see there that 92, this is public opinion survey research from Public Safety Canada, where 92% of Canadians said that they were aware of risks facing their households. So certainly interested to continue partnerships as we dive into different methodologies. And these are great numbers, but I think the insurance folks have different numbers, and we probably want to trade notes and know more about yours, and you want to know more about ours. You'll have the slides, so you'll see more. You'll have these slides later about some more of the other data. The important one that's not on the slide is the one that we're not on track to meet, and that was about moving from awareness to action. So we also had a target about number of people who had taken action, were aware of the risk and then had taken action, and those numbers are lower than we had hoped for them to be. So still work to do, obviously, in that space as it's come up before. Supposed to be a diagram on this one. Let me see. Okay, no, it's not. So I'm talking a little bit about the implementation here of the National Adaptation Strategy. And as we go through the presentation, I wanted to turn to the audience to talk a little bit more about what you see as the barriers and the challenges to adaptation. And so I mentioned that we're at an important inflection point in adaptation. So right now we're taking stock through the progress report, but we're also setting up for the new policy process and the renewal process for federal programs. The majority of federal programs, they run on a certain cycle, and so as a scheduled cycle, they would be sunsetting coming up, and so we're initiating the process to review and assess all the federal programs. So this is your opportunity to tell me, federal government person who is convening the federal government, designing the programs and measures that we would look as a next implementation strategy, what some of your thoughts and reflections and needs are. And so this diagram, when it shows up properly, is an iceberg, and at the top it shows extreme weather impacts and infrastructure damage, and talking about those as the ways that we see the climate impacts and we feel them, they're tangible, they're what we see. But underneath the iceberg is what some of the systemic challenges are, the impacts that result from those things. And so I'm going to turn to a mentee for the next one to hear from you a little bit more about the barriers. But we know that the economic strain, whether it's supply chains, whether it's small businesses that can't open after a climate event, their communities have been devastated, and a small business just isn't able to open again afterwards. We had talked about the inequalities where different populations are disproportionately affected by climate change. So reflecting on some of those challenges, and we know funding is important, so we're going to try and set that one aside. But in terms of funding, what do you find as the biggest barrier for you in taking adaptation action? And interested to hear thoughts and views. And it seems like there's maybe one coming up to the top right away. Yeah, capacity and time. Implementation funding. Okay, maybe planning funding. There's planning funding, but then not funding to implement. We hear that one a lot. It's maybe, yeah, okay. Competing priorities, right. And I think the competing priorities touches on the theme of the conference, where we talk about mainstreaming and this idea that we're trying to advance so many policy measures all at once, and then trying to factor climate change in on top of that can be challenging. Political will. Okay. I see some other ones that are interesting there in terms of training, see resources, inequity, buy-in, political will and buy-in probably go together a bit. Maybe one's on the political side, one's on the community. Okay, thanks for that input. That's fantastic. Really appreciate that. And if you want to engage more on what we're doing for the renewal and where we're at in adaptation, obviously, that's what I'm here for today, so that you can get to know me and know to reach out. So despite the barriers, I will keep going through the presentation to just talk a little bit more about, despite the barriers, there is a lot of great work happening in the region. And so highlighting some of the case studies or examples that we have heard and that have been shared that are important. And again, I'll just draw emphasis to some of the federal programming under the National Adaptation Strategy that has been supporting this. So fire smarting in Wadden Bay. And so I think this has been supported in part by the Resilient Wildfire Futures Initiative, and has been an important approach for the community, where wildfires continue to be a tremendous challenge, we understand. In Alberta, the Springbank Off-Stream Reservoir, which I think was funded in part by the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and looking at flooding in the region, Calgary and downstream. And the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training Program that's driving education and capacity. We have colleagues here in the room who've worked on that project that was funded, I think, through the BRACE program and through some GMF funding as well. So lots of good work happening. I'll just touch briefly on emerging and developing issues as well. The nice thing about getting to go near the end of the conference is that some of these have already been brought up. So we talked about AI, for instance, and the competing or the complexities there. But some of the others, when we were developing the National Adaptation Strategy, it wasn't that these items weren't on our radar, but I think that they've just intensified since the time that we developed the strategy. So defense and security, the ongoing and persistent dislocation of people, and we know that Indigenous communities are often disproportionately affected when it comes to evacuations and being dislocated from their communities for a long period of time, which has all kinds of knock-on effects. The financial and economic resilience, I think, is really important because, as we've talked about, public sector funding won't be sufficient to address the challenge. And so how do we bring in private sector finance? And the insurance industry is interested to do a lot in this space, but as has come up, the sustainability of the insurance sector, whether that's strain on the sector itself or if it's insurance affordability, those things I think a lot of us are taking really seriously and trying to look at and develop solutions. So just wanted to flag a couple of those things that I think we have on our radar and coming forward. Continued whole of society implementation and approach. So I'll just start to wind up the presentation by noting that because the National Adaptation Strategy is whole of society, it does require the collective effort of all. And so we hope to continue to partner with organizations in this ecosystem in Canada. I think we're quite fortunate to have the regional climate services organizations in particular. And always when I'm giving my presentations, I like to give a shout out to those organizations, because when I meet with others internationally, they're envious of us, of having these organizations that have their ear to the ground and working with governments and working in community and having resources to take people through the adaptation journey. So just giving a big shout out that I think that's something that we shouldn't take for granted in Canada as part of the ecosystem of organizations that we have. And then I'm just going to conclude by some sneak peeks of some things that are taking place ahead. And so I mentioned about the National Adaptation Strategy Progress Report. So that should be released in the coming weeks, fingers crossed. And that will provide, as I said, a transparent look at how we're doing on climate change adaptation. And we hope fosters a national dialogue on adaptation where we're taking stock of where we're at, a realistic take stock of where we're at, trying to celebrate successes but point out where there's challenges. And when we look at the adaptation cycle, progress reporting to say how are we doing is really important. And then in the next step in the cycle, it talks about, but how is the climate changing? And so that resets our baseline of what are we doing next. And so a really important report coming next is the Canada and the Changing Climate Report, also this spring. This is a highly influential report. The last one was released in 2019. And if you're working in the climate change space, you've probably quoted this report, whether you know you did or not, you've probably quoted from it. And so the next edition will be coming out shortly. And so please keep your eyes out on that, because it's the scientific and evidence base that should be underpinning our actions and important findings in it. And then the last one I'll leave you with is the Adaptation Canada Conference. And there's a typo on my slide, if you remember, 246. So it's September 22nd to 24th, 2026. So just disregard the typo, unless you want to stay from the 22nd to 26th. If you're enjoying yourself, maybe you can stay longer. And Sherry is at the back here, and she has invitations. If you need like a paper invitation, she's got one for you there. There they are. Yeah, that's perfect. And this is a national conference, so this is an important opportunity for us to gather. And so we see this arc of these two reports being released in the spring, see what we get over the summer, but odds are we're going to be reminded of the importance of climate change, and then we'll have this conference at the end of the summer. And so hopefully this is setting us up to refresh our dialogue on adaptation, to understand where we want to go, to look at what really needs to happen, and we're here to have that conversation and try and support that action across all levels. And so I'll leave it there, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.